I'm Nelson McDaniel, and I'm here with my friend Carol Becton. We are introducing a series of interviews that are going to be important in terms of people learning more about the history of New Bern. Good Shepherd addressed one of those needs. So thank you for telling us so much about it.
My pleasure. I'm ready to tell more because other things happened as well. As I said, there were many Good Samaritans, all noteworthy. That's why I call them Good Samaritans. And I see Reverend Johnson as indeed the Good Shepherd.
Yes.
As the pastor, the rector of St. Cyprian, and immediately serving the community as a Good Shepherd. In fact, there is a monument, a statue outside of St. Cyprian Church on the Queen Street side, because it kind of sits, I call it on a peninsula. But on that statue that you see of the Good Shepherd, the shepherd standing with his arms out and the children by his side, that statue was originally in the main entrance of Good Shepherd Hospital. When you first entered the door, now this I remember seeing when I went there as a child, it greeted you. It sat in like a little alcove, a little waiting area, but that statue, that was where it was originally. And then when ceased being a hospital, it went to St. Cyprian.
Went to St. Cyprian's.
So yes, the work of a Good Shepherd and Good Samaritans after the fire brought forth something very beautiful and wonderful to the community. And again, I hope it won't be lost because of the new name.
And St. Cyprian's, of course, very handsome building that is in need of some restoration work now, in part because of Hurricane Florence. It has a fascinating history, and of course, this role that it played is a very important part of that history. It's one of the 5 historically black churches in the Episcopal Diocese of East Carolina, and is such very important to the fabric of the history of the church. And so I always feel as if that's one of the important buildings that people in New Bern and people who visit New Bern need to know about, along with Good Shepherd.
I totally agree. You are exactly right. You are exactly right. And again, as I was talking about the change of name for the Good Shepherd building, my heart is there at St. Cyprian as well. And among some of those other, what I call Good Samaritans, it included the principal of then West Street School, Mr. J.T. Barber.
Yes.
And he was a great Samaritan within that church. Talk about how he taught Sunday school and all of the work that he did as a member of that church. And not only him, but even when we were looking at the committee that was formed to do something about the hospital, he was among them. And we're going to learn out later he was in other projects.
Yes.
Won't go into now, but that much about the colored library. And he was also noted in the community as the father of education for Negroes. He did such a tremendous job in strengthening and raising the standard of education for Negroes in this area. He did a great job. He took West Street School and just expanded in so many different ways. The graduation classes went from 14 to 80 and on and on. The school published a newspaper called The Planet. The actual yearbook, initially it was the yearbook called The Planet. Well, it continued to carry that name until we graduated in 70. But Mr. Barber and many others, many others.
Yes, indeed. Of course, it's wonderful that there is a school in New Bern, a fine school that bears his name. So hopefully his name will always be in front of people. And his family home still stands and is a beautiful home on West Street, across the street from where the West Street.
And it's neighbor to Good Shepherd Hospital.
And neighbor to Good Shepherd Hospital, right there on West Street. So a very important historic street in New Bern.
It is. It really is. And there's another member I will mention because she and her family as well played a major role in the advancement of Negroes in New Bern and maintaining the struggle and overcoming the fire and a lot of other things. And her name was Charlotte Rhone. And not only Charlotte, her family, her sister Amy, her sister Carrie, her sister Henrietta. Carrie was born, I believe it was in like 1874 or 5. But her father was born in 1842, and her mother was born in 1852. they were born during slavery. Whether or not they were indeed slaves, they were born during slavery and
Yes.
before the Civil War. As I studied Carrie and that family, what I found is that it was instilled in them, their faith, serving in their community, and education.
Yes.
And they lived up to it.
And those Rhone sisters are so important in that history. And as you say, sometimes when you go back through families, it's because New Bern had a very large free black community. It's hard to determine sometimes who was enslaved and who was not enslaved, but certainly they, if you go back through that period, it was a crucible in which so many issues relating to justice were being discussed. And the Rhone sisters grew up in that, and they all made great contributions to this area, to this town, to this state. I wonder if you would share with us a little bit about some of those contributions, including places like the Rhone Hotel, but not exclusive to that.
Okay, I will. I'd love to. And I just want to, as I go into the Rhone family, just want to go back and reiterate that New Bern's history is rich, and it should be. It's inclusive of many outstanding and noteworthy African American individuals. That Great Fire of 1922 not only served as a catalyst to the realization of a hospital for for Negroes in New Bern, but it also birthed a resting place for Negro travelers. I mentioned that the fire was in 1922, but I found so much joy and delight in, and admiration as well, is that by 1923, Charlotte Rhone, Henrietta Rhone, and Mary Rhone had rebuilt. Now, their home was destroyed during the fire. They lived in an African-American historic part of New Bern called Dry Borough that has a rich history of its own. In fact, they were right kind of across the street down over from St. Cyprian Church. So that was their neighborhood church. That was home. But at any rate, their home was destroyed during the fire. They, like the other thousands, had to live in a tent. They had to apply and get a tent as well, and they lived in that tent. But immediately during that year, because the fire was December of 92, but by the end of, 1922, but by the end of 1923, the Rhone Hotel had been built. A beautiful brick structure. It's still located on Queen Street, not far from the railroad station, which was important because a lot of the Negro porters who worked for the train station, when they came, they didn't have any place to stay. That became one of their favorite spots, and they even referred to it as the Rhone Home instead of the Rhone Hotel. The sisters lived on the upper floor, and they had the rooms below as the rooms that they rented out. They even had a basement that they would use a lot of times when they had reached capacity on the other floor. And so they had the Rhone Hotel. And I'm so impressed that within a year, they had the fortitude to do that. But, I haven't mentioned the things that Charlotte alone, when we look at her life, didn't mention that Charlotte always wanted to be a nurse. She had read and learned about nurses, Negro nurses, and one of them, I think, was Mary Mahoney, and there was another one. But at any rate, Charlotte decided she wanted to become a nurse. In her efforts in trying to find a school here in North Carolina, she could not find one that would admit her because she was indeed a Negro. And it took a lot of searching and a lot of turn downs because there weren't any here in in North Carolina who would admit her. But she was eventually admitted to the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., which is a part of the campus of Howard, we know still now as Howard University. And she did go on to become a nurse, and she was excited about that. She came back to New Bern, ready to roll up her sleeves, put on her white uniform, and serve as a nurse. However, and unfortunately, she was not hired because in New Bern, none of the hospitals here would hire her as a nurse, and that was before the fire. It was around, I think, about 1908 when she finally In fact, she took nursing to a different level for Negroes. A part of becoming registered, you had to be a part of affiliated with a national organization of high standards. So what she did, along with other Negro nurses throughout the United States, they formed the National Association of Colored Nurses. And then from that, she was able to go on and become a registered nurse. And she was the first Black registered nurse in North Carolina. And as I did a little more research, I found out that she had become the first Negro nurse about a week before Caleb Braden, that we know as the Dr. Pep. Not Dr. Pep, yeah, Pepsi Cola. Pepsi Cola inventor. That was his sister. She had just gotten her become a registered nurse as well about the same time that Charlotte did. And unfortunately, she was never really able to get a job as a nurse in a hospital. Now, she did assist and go along with doctors, white doctors, as they went throughout the county. And she did help deliver babies. She did that. But she never got a job. And she worked a little while even on the campus of what is now North Carolina Central University. It was then North Carolina Normal School in Durham. She worked there in the infirmary. But she wanted to come back to New Bern, and she did. And she continued, because she was undaunted. Although she was not allowed to work in a hospital, she did work, as I said, along with doctors. And then the work she did along with Dr. Johnson, Reverend Johnson and Dr. Latham, with those people who were victims of the fire inside of St. Cyprian. She was eventually made county social worker by Craven County. She became the first colored social worker in Craven County. And her work preceded her, and her gift made a room for her. She was even asked to help exterminate. There was a rat infestation in the Duffyfield area in the colored section, I call it. And she was assigned the task of making sure that the rats were exterminated. There's a newspaper article on that. And she did, in fact, know what procedures to put in place to make that happen. And it did happen. She was also called upon to lead the annual Emancipation Celebration programs. I have been working with Mr. Victor Jones at the library in the Kellenberger room, hoping that I could find actual articles or any artifact that attests to that, because I'd really like to see it reenacted or just made aware, because there's so much of our history that we don't know. So when we talk about Charlotte and her family, in fact, 1 year prior to the fire, in March of 1921, she had her older sister. Carrie was the second child. This other sister, Caroline Rhone, was here in New Bern. She had married very influential, very rich Negroes, one of the richest Negro men in the state of North Carolina. He had holdings in some of the mills in the western part of the state. He served as a representative. He was very active. He was a realtor. In fact, he was a realtor, and there was a section off of Cedar Street in the Duffyfield community that had been named for him called Smithtown. In fact, if you're familiar with the Omega Center, there is a street that runs right behind it called Smith Street, and that would lead back into what was then Smithtown. But at any rate, her husband was very wealthy, and she was very prominent as well in her own rights. She had studied in Boston and different places throughout the United States. But anyway, in 1921, Carrie chartered for the Negro women here in New Bern, North Carolina. She chartered an organization that is still in existence called the Climbers Club. It is she chartered it through the National Association of Colored Women. And that was done to maintain high standards for Negro women in our community, letting everybody know that we have something to offer, and we do indeed do that. I'm honored to say that I am a member. That legacy still goes on. Harry initiated it, and her sister Charlotte that I've just spoken of, she also was one of the first charter members of the organization. And if you remember, when I was talking about the doctors who were the Negro doctors at Good Shepherd, there was a Dr. Mann. Now, Dr. Mann's wife became a part of it. She also served, she was a colored superintendent of the colored schools in New Bern while she was here as well. So you can see the connection and what those sisters did. As I said, they worked together in that hotel, making that work, and it did. It was a great success until it probably closed, I believe, in the late 50s is when it finally closed.
Two remarkable stories about all of these remarkable sisters who made such contributions not only here but across the state. And we have material culture that reminds us, as you mentioned, the Rhone Hotel still stands. Also, the Isaac Smith House still stands. So when we look at the material culture around New Bern, much of it reminds us, even though the Great Fire destroyed much of that, there were many places that remain standing and remind us of how important these stories are. As we think about these stories, it's interesting that we tell them now and often tell them under the aegis of African American history, but to me, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because these are history. They are not African American history, they're history. The fact that we to some degree feel obligated to tell them today as separate stories is simply a sad reminder of the fact that during Jim Crow and during the period of segregation that came particularly onerous at the end of the 19th century and through the first half of the 20th century, many of these stories, many of these major contributors to the common story, their stories were systematically suppressed because they didn't fit the narrative of white supremacy. And the important thing about telling these stories isn't that they are black history, it's that they are history. And thank goodness, Carol, there are people like you and many other people. I'm particularly grateful to someone like Ethel Staten, of course, who is working right now to make sure that Charlotte Rhone's cemetery marker is restored. It's very important that these people be remembered because they made tremendous contributions at a time when it was very difficult for people to make these kinds of contributions. So it's wonderful that you are such a great storyteller for these people, and as long as you and others are telling the stories, then these people are really living. One of the things that I've always admired about France is that if you go to the Académie Française, when great French writers are referenced, if you reference them biographically and they're dead, then you use the past tense. If you reference what they say and what they write, as long as they're still being read, they're referenced in the present tense, so that you would say Voltaire died, and give the year of his death. But if you were referencing something he wrote, you would say Voltaire says this. So as long as people are telling these stories, and thank goodness there are people telling these stories, more now than perhaps in a long time, these folks, like the Rhone Sisters, continue to live through the stories that people tell, and they deserve to have those stories told because they made quite a difference. And so I'm so grateful to you, Carol, that you are one of those storytellers.
It's a joy to me. It sounds cliche, but it is such a passion, and I can see so much of my history kind of fading right in front of me as an African American in New Bern as I look at Negro neighborhoods that I lived in as a child growing up, and I just literally see them vanishing right before my eyes. So history is very important to me, and I'm so glad that you mentioned Mrs. Staten. I know earlier I mentioned Dryborough, and she has done such an outstanding job plotting out the history of Dryborough and presenting it and keeping it alive in the Dryborough community. Not only that, as you said, making arrangements now to see what we can do, get a headstone and memorial to Charlotte Rhone and other things as well. She continues to do that. I'm proud to say that that's another one of my teachers. I know we talked earlier and we talked about another teacher, but Mrs. Ethel Martin Staten taught me as well. She was my high school PE teacher and health. Yeah. Makes my heart feel good, and I'm so proud of her. And another teacher that I can't not mention her name, and that's Miss Dorcas Carter. I looked over an article that she had written. I believe hers was for the News and Observer, but it was on this great fire. and she covered it in detail. She was a young girl at the time, but she remembered it, and she presented it well, as she always did, whatever she did. My fifth grade teacher, very articulate, very meticulous about whatever she did, and she taught that to us as well. I'm grateful to her. I'm grateful to Mrs. Martin. I'm also grateful to Miss Mary Peterkin, who has also done outstanding work with African American history as it regards to the Greenwood Cemetery. I remember the headstones that she worked on that had been taken from, I believe, from Cedar Grove back to Greenwood, or to Greenwood. I remember that ceremony, and I also believe it is attributed to her the Trail of Flames that gave the main points and the history and the map of that great fire that we were discussing. And so, yes, it needs to be told. You can get to telling, because I forgot to mention, but I know it would probably come up later. But I usually forget to even mention that, with the fire having been in 1922, and it taken about 15 years to recoup, to get Good Shepherd after actually standing, we still went through depression.